Miss Marple is called to a quiet village where a chapel holds a disturbing silence. No voice echoes within its walls. What begins as a curious oddity soon reveals ties to a missing parishioner, and a secret kept in the stonework. With her keen eye for human nature, Miss Marple must uncover why the chapel swallows every sound and what crime it hides. Chapter 1. The silence beneath the hymn. First truly fine day of spring in St. Sed's in the Weald was the sort that made even the most cynical widowers pause to admire the daffodils. The air was crisp but kind. The bells from St. Sed's Chapel chimed their usual quarter hours, and preparations were well underway for the upcoming centennial service, an event that had stirred more excitement than any sermon ever could. It had been 100 years since the stone chapel at the top of Crook's Hill was consecrated. In honor of this most venerable milestone, the parish council had arranged for a grand commemorative service and luncheon, complete with an antique organ performance, historical exhibition, and a visiting bishop with a voice said to make even the worst singers sound vaguely redeemed. Miss Marple, seated near the edge of the crowd at the planning committee's garden tea, was watching the faces, not the flower arrangements. I do think, Mrs. Isabel Fanshawe was saying, that we ought to have fresh banners stitched for the interior, something with gold trim, and doves, possibly lilies. We can't afford lilies, Isabel, muttered the vicar's wife, smoothing her skirt. There's a war memorial fund surplus, isn't there? Isabel continued, tapping a sugared scone. It's not as though the dead will notice, a few of the more pious gasped. Miss Marple, however, merely sipped her tea. She had noticed that ever since the centennial had been announced, people had begun behaving rather oddly. Nervous, perhaps, short-tempered, not the entire village, of course, but just a handful of the usual pillars. Miss Marple had learned long ago that celebrations have a peculiar way of unsettling certain types of conscience. Old buildings are rarely the only things that house secrets. Across the lawn, Reverend Pilling stood beside the towering figure of Dr. Lionel March, the retired headmaster and current church warden. They were speaking in hushed tones near the yew trees. He's been different since the service rehearsal, someone whispered behind Miss Marple. Who? Dr. March? No, Stephen. That would be Stephen Broomfield, the chapel's caretaker. Young, quiet, and meticulously neat. He had been in charge of preparing the altar, polishing the brass, and handling the recently restored antique lectern donated by the Lazenby estate. Miss Marple, under the guise of adjusting her shawl, caught a glimpse of Stephen leaning against the stone wall that bordered the garden. He looked pale, twitchy. He wasn't speaking to anyone. The following morning, the village awoke to a far less tranquil tune. Stephen Broomfield was found dead, slumped across the chapel's front pew just beneath the stained glass window of St. Michael. The cause was not immediately evident, but his head had struck the edge of the wooden pew with just enough force to leave a thin line of blood on the altar rail. No scream had been heard, no struggle reported. Reverend Pilling had opened the chapel doors for morning prayers and found the body alone. In the eerie hush of the sanctuary, the only sound was the faint creak of the rafters and the strangely muffled silence that hung in the air, as though the very chapel had swallowed its own breath. Word of the death spread swiftly through St. Sed's. The baker's wife told the greengrocer, who told the milkman, who informed Mrs. Fanshawe by 9:30. By the time the constable arrived, the matter was already being referred to with appropriate gravity as the chapel tragedy. Miss Marple, walking back from the post office with a new skein of cream-colored wool, paused outside the chapel to observe. She noticed several things. First, the vestry window, usually locked, was opened by a sliver. Second, Dr. March stood apart from the others, his face set not in shock but in something closer to grim resignation. And third, there was an oddness to the atmosphere inside the chapel. Miss Marple could not hear her own footsteps clearly, nor the rustle of her skirt. There was a strange, absorbing quiet to the building now. Not simply silence, but the kind of stillness one might find inside a box, or behind closed velvet curtains. It was as though the chapel had stopped echoing. That afternoon, Inspector Fisk from the county came to take charge of the investigation. He was brisk, practical, and untroubled by village subtleties. His conclusion was soon declared: accidental death, a slip, perhaps a minor heart episode preceding the fall. The village accepted this quietly, officially. But Miss Marple did not. A healthy young man does not fall silently in a space that once carried sound. A vestry window does not open itself. And a village with secrets never stops whispering. Not even in prayer. As she passed the chapel again that evening, she glanced at the carved inscription over the doorway: "Speak, for thy servant heareth," and Miss Marple, ever the quietest servant of observation, began to listen. Chapter 2. The village sings its own verses. The death of Stephen Broomfield cast a strange sort of hush over St. Sed's in the Weald, one not unlike the new silence in the chapel itself. Though outwardly the village carried on as expected, with buns still sold at the bakery, hens still clucking behind stone fences, and milk bottles still rattling onto porches, there was something restrained in the way people spoke, as if their words were aware of the walls listening. Miss Marple observed this carefully over the next 2 days. Her walks were, as always, modest and well-timed: to the grocer in the morning, the post office by midday, and the vicarage by tea. But behind her quiet blue eyes, she was already arranging a pattern, not yet a picture, but a sketch with familiar strokes. There was a dead young man in the chapel, a vestry window left ajar, and a building that had suddenly stopped echoing. She did not believe in such convenient coincidences. At the village tea shop, the usual conversations now skirted delicately around the subject. "They say he hit his head," murmured Mrs. Tilling, spooning sugar into her tea. "A terrible fall. Probably fainted. HMPH, said Mr. Clark, the butcher. "He was always a peculiar sort, wasn't he? Fussed over candle polish and vestment pleats. To quiet by half. I heard he was troubled," whispered Margaret Knowles. "Something about a letter. A letter?" Miss Marple echoed softly, looking up from her untouched biscuit. Margaret flushed, but leaned in. "Yes, well, apparently he left one. Reverend Pilling found it tucked in the lectern drawer. Nobody said what it contained, but I dare say it was something tragic. You know how young people get moody, dramatic." Miss Marple's fingers folded gently in her lap. "Dear me, and I thought he was quite practical. He once mended a loose altar rail with a single piece of brass and a teaspoon. Wouldn't know it," muttered Mr. Clark. "Now look what's come of him. One of the vestrymen says the bishop's thinking of canceling the centennial service altogether. That was interesting." Back at Danemead, Miss Marple sat beside the fire and recalled the last time she had seen Stephen Broomfield. It had been a week before the fatal morning he had passed her on the lane near the old almshouses, arms full of rolled hymnals and a careful look on his face. He had nodded to her, polite but distracted. She remembered thinking, even then, that his eyes were carrying something heavy: a letter, a silence, a chapel that no longer echoed. The pieces were setting themselves in front of her, as they often did, not ordered yet, but waiting to be sorted. That evening, Inspector Fisk paid an unannounced call at the vicarage, which Miss Marple happened to observe from the side lane, where she had been inspecting the chapel's guttering from a safe and respectable distance. Inside, behind lace-draped windows, she saw the inspector standing stiffly, Reverend Pilling seated opposite him with hands folded in his lap. There was a box on the vicar's table, mahogany, square, with a brass latch. Miss Marple returned home with slightly brisker steps. By morning, the village was abuzz again. The police had reopened their inquiry. The letter, it seemed, was not what it had first appeared. Or perhaps not a letter at all. Miss Marple did not inquire directly. That was never her way. Instead, she took a walk to the rectory and left a jar of plum jam at the kitchen door for Mrs. Pilling, along with a small handwritten recipe for almond tartlets, a token of kindness that, she knew, often worked better than questions. She needn't have waited long. By late afternoon, a knock came at Dane Mead. It was Inspector Fisk, head in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, "might I trouble you for a moment?" "Of course, Inspector. Won't you come in?" He remained standing, glancing briefly around the tastefully ordered sitting room, as if hoping the very air might be more cooperative here than in his case files. "We've reason to believe," he began, "that Mr. Broomfield's death may not have been accidental." Miss Marple did not feign surprise. "There was no letter after all?" she asked gently. Fisk exhaled. "No. What was found in the lectern drawer was an envelope, yes, but empty, folded precisely, as if something had been removed, or never placed inside to begin with." He gave her a measured look. "Precisely. And the vestry window? Thus disturbed. Someone entered that way, possibly left that way too, before or after the body was discovered. That's what we're trying to determine." Miss Marple folded her hands over her skirt. "I suspect the answer lies in something more subtle than footprints, Inspector." He frowned. "Such as?" Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the chapel's spire peeked through the morning mist. "A chapel that doesn't echo," she said quietly. "That's where I would start." Fisk looked at her, then followed her gaze. After a moment, he said, "Do you know, I had noticed that. It was odd. The organ sounded dull, no resonance. Even footsteps sounded strange. And the chapel had perfect acoustics before, didn't it?" "Perfect," he nodded. "Supposedly part of its architectural glory." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Then perhaps someone wanted that glory muted. And sometimes when you mute a space, you hide what's truly being said inside it." The inspector stared at her, blinking once. "You think it's more than a symbolic silence?" Miss Marple gave him the faintest smile. "I think, Inspector, that someone silenced the chapel to ensure no one would hear what they weren't meant to. And with that, the first real thread had been tugged. The chapel had lost its echo." But Miss Marple had just begun to listen. Chapter 3, Behind the Velvet Sound. Following day, Miss Marple made a quiet but deliberate visit to the chapel. It was early before the cleaning ladies had arrived, and before the Reverend's routine inspection of the altar silver. The morning air still clung to the old stones, giving the place the feel of having just awakened. The doors creaked open beneath her gloved hand, and she stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the cool dimness, and there it was again, that strange, unnatural hush. St. Sed's had always been a chapel of gentle reverberation. A hymn sung here lingered for just a breath after the last note. The tiniest footfall had once carried forward, softened only by time and incense. But now Miss Marple's footsteps made no reply. The room seemed to swallow sound, like an old theater filled with drapery. She moved slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. The floor had been polished recently, perhaps by the police, perhaps by habit. Candles sat unlit in their brass holders, and the faint smell of lemon oil drifted from the lectern. She stopped near the front pew, the one where Stephen Broomfield had been found. A slim ribbon of dried blood still marked the corner, the only imperfection in the otherwise immaculate sanctuary. Miss Marple's eyes drifted upward, to the narrow slits of the clerestory windows, then to the stone ribs of the ceiling. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She turned slowly, scanning the perimeter of the room, and then she saw it, above the choir stalls, where the ornate stone met a series of narrow wooden panels. Something subtle had altered. In the upper corners of the chapel, where once bare limestone had met old varnished pine, There were now long velvet banners draped across the stone, hanging in rich burgundy folds. Decorative, yes, but excessive, and heavy. Miss Marple walked toward the nearest one. They hadn't been there during the previous month's evensong. She remembered clearly because she had commented to Mrs. Fanshawe on the starkness of the apse during the final hymn, and now these banners had appeared, hanging like theater curtains. She raised a gloved hand and gently pinched the corner of one. The fabric was thick, heavier than it should be for simple decor, possibly even sound dampening. Miss Marple, she turned, unstartled, as Reverend Pilling entered through the side aisle. He wore a coat over his cassock and looked surprised, though not displeased. To see her. My apologies, she said mildly. I wish to speak with you, and I thought I might find you here. He smiled faintly. I suppose it's natural, isn't it? We're all trying to make sense of what happened. They stood together near the front pew, the air between them scented with wax and the faintest trace of must. It's a strange thing, she said, to stand in a place meant for reflection and to hear nothing at all. Pilling nodded, but said nothing. These banners, she continued gently, were they your idea? He blinked. Oh, those. No, Dr. March had them installed. Said the acoustics needed softening for the bishop's voice. He insisted on it. Dr. March is particular, Miss Marple mused. He always has been. The vicar said quietly. This chapel is his pride. He's written 2 articles on its construction for Church Quarterly. Miss Marple let the words settle. Tell me, she asked, did Stephen Broomfield and Dr. March get along? Pilling's answer came with a pause. They respected each other, but I wouldn't say they were close. Stephen was meticulous in the same way, though perhaps that created friction. Did Dr. March know that Stephen had been found near the lectern? A shift in the vicar's expression told her what she needed to know. Yes, he admitted. And he was quite upset. Said it was irreverent, that the body shouldn't have been left so close to the pulpit. But we hadn't moved anything when the constable arrived. Miss Marple's thoughts turned. It was not irreverence that disturbed Dr. March, it was something about the location, or what might have been seen or heard there. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Lazenby estate, home of Mrs. Lettice Lazenby, who had recently donated the antique lectern to the chapel. A formidable woman in her 70s with a voice like organ pipes. She greeted Miss Marple with a sniff and a cautious eye. Stephen was the one who came to inspect the lectern before we gave it, she said, leading Miss Marple into a drawing room stuffed with ancestral portraits. Took measurements, even polished the brass himself before transporting it. Did he say anything unusual at the time? Mrs. Lazenby pursed her lips. He asked after my late brother. Said he'd seen a reference to him in the chapel's records. Odd that my brother died in France during the war. Has nothing to do with St. Ced's. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you know where in the records he saw the name? No idea, but he seemed very thoughtful after that. Very pale, that evening, back at Danemead. Miss Marple laid out her thoughts on a sheet of notepaper. She drew no conclusions yet, but listed her facts into columns. Stephen Broomfield had found something, possibly in the chapel records, possibly connected to someone's past. He had been found near the lectern. Not the altar. An empty envelope had been found intended for a letter. Perhaps removed. Dr. March had ordered heavy banners hung before the bishop's visit, conveniently muting sound. The chapel no longer echoed. Despite no structural change, she stared at the list. And slowly, one thought began to emerge. The silence had not merely hidden the sound of a murder. It had hidden the sound of something else. That night, she could not sleep. The wind stirred the branches outside her window, and somewhere in the village, a dog barked once and fell silent. Miss Marple lay awake, with one question echoing through her mind. What, precisely, had Stephen Broomfield heard in that chapel that someone had tried so carefully to silence forever? Chapter 4. voices beneath the hymnal stew days after her visit to the Lazenby estate. Miss Marple attended the chapel's Thursday morning quiet hour, a time when the sanctuary was open for individual prayer and reflection. Only a few parishioners wandered in during the hour, most of them elderly women who preferred the early hush to the chatter of Sunday services. Miss Marple arrived early and took her usual place on the second pew from the back. She brought no prayer book. Her eyes, instead, moved steadily from the velvet-draped choir panels to the lectern, and then to the heavy doors that led to the vestry. There was a subtle difference in the air today. The silence had returned, yes, but now she knew its source. The velvet banners and the position of the lectern, she noted, had also shifted. It sat several feet further back than its usual place, an odd thing for so old and weighty a piece of furniture. Once the others had trickled away, she remained seated. And then, deliberately, she dropped her lace handkerchief, bending to retrieve it. She let her gaze fall beneath the pews, noting the scuffed stone. But it was not the stone that caught her attention, it was the grill of the ancient heating vent. Beneath the choir stalls, she leaned slightly, peering through it, a faint glint of metal. She would have to return with better light later that afternoon. Under the polite excuse of wishing to donate a pair of new altar cloths, Miss Marple returned to the chapel with Inspector Fisk. He was more cooperative now. Her observations on the acoustic changes, on Dr. March's sudden interference with the chapel's design, and on the odd positioning of the lectern had stirred something in his instincts. Together, they approached the heating vent with a thin flashlight and a gloved hand. Fisk reached in and retrieved a small object. It was a delicate, slim silver brooch, simple but old, the sort worn on clerical stoles or priestly collars marked with a faint engraving. B.L. Miss Marple turned to him. "Blake Lazenby," she said. "Mrs. Lazenby's brother, the one who died in France." Fisk frowned. And what would his brooch be doing under a chapel vent? "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "Unless he hadn't died in France at all." They returned to Danemead, and Miss Marple once again laid out her threads. Blake Lazenby had been declared dead in 1918. The family received notice. The village mourned. But Mrs. Lazenby, in her conversation, had made a peculiar comment that Stephen had asked after her brother not about him. He had seen something in the chapel's records, something that disturbed him. Miss Marple went to her writing bureau and removed a small folder marked chapel donations and memorials. She had kept notes on these since 1949, mostly out of a fondness for church history. Inside was a clipping from the parish newsletter dated 3 years prior, a generous donation from Mrs. Lettice Lazenby to fund the refurbishment of the side chapel, in memory of her late brother Blake Lazenby 1889 to 1918. His name to be inscribed on the memorial plaque in time for the November All Souls service. Miss Marple had attended that service, but she now recalled with clarity the plaque had never been unveiled. Something about a delay in the engraving. Reverend Pilling had made a brief apology. It had never been brought up again. She folded the clipping and tapped it thoughtfully. What if Blake Lazenby had never died in France? What if he had returned under another name? Or worse, what if someone had known he had not died and gone to great lengths to ensure no one else ever discovered it? The next morning, she paid a visit to the chapel vestry. Reverend Pilling greeted her warmly but with visible fatigue. The investigation had taken its toll. The chapel had grown quiet. Yes, but so had the congregation. People were uneasy. Sunday had been sparsely attended. "I was hoping," Miss Marple said, "to look at the chapel's archive ledger, the one that Stephen used to keep so neatly." Pilling raised an eyebrow. "The records?" "Yes, I have a theory," she added gently. "And if I'm right, it may not only explain Stephen's death but a lie that has sat in our chapel for decades." He unlocked the heavy cabinet beneath the vestry's back desk and withdrew a bound volume. It was old, leather-backed, with aging parchment pages and the scent of cedar oil. Together, they turned through its entries. Lists of donors, notes on repairs, minor correspondence, and then 3/4 through a curious set of pages. One entry dated 1920, barely legible, noted, received funds for pew restoration, source undisclosed. Processed through third-party solicitor under initials BL. Another entry. 2 pages later, in a different hand, read, burial record misplaced. Chapel grounds entry marked as provisional awaiting confirmation. Name, Blake Lazenby. Miss Marple pointed to it. This, she said, is what Stephen found. But why wouldn't he have told anyone? The Reverend asked, puzzled. Because, she replied, he knew someone had forged it, perhaps even altered it again more recently, and he wasn't sure who he could trust, so he went quiet. He meant to leave a note, but someone got to him first. She stood. I must speak with Dr. March. Dr. Lionel March was not at home when she arrived at his cottage near the Mill Road. His housekeeper, a dour woman named Ada, said he had gone to the church archives in the neighboring village of Clanatharp. Miss Marple waited. When he returned an hour later, she was seated on his front bench with her knitting in hand. He paled at the sight of her. Miss Marple, he said, setting down his satchel. What brings you to me? The truth, she said gently, about Blake Lazenby, about the plaque that was never unveiled, and about what Stephen heard inside the chapel. He said nothing. She continued. He heard your voice, didn't he? The night before he died. You were arguing, or pleading. You thought the banners would muffle it, but chapels have strange acoustics. They remember. Dr. March sank onto the step. He found the record. He whispered. I thought no one would ever look. I tried to talk him down to explain that it would ruin Mrs. Lazenby, that it was ancient history. And when he refused, I didn't mean to kill him, he said, voice cracked. I just wanted him to see reason. He turned to leave, tripped on the lectern base, hit his head. You moved the body, Miss Marple said softly. You thought if he were found near the pew, it might look like a simple fall. You moved the envelope too. He nodded. And I hung the banners. Earlier that week, because he'd threatened to speak during the bishop's service. I panicked. Miss Marple sat beside him. Her voice, when she spoke, was as quiet as the chapel itself. You may have meant only to hush a voice, but silence, Dr. March, is never empty. It always echoes eventually. He wept. And Miss Marple, though composed, knew the echo of this particular silence would remain in St. Sed's for years to come. Chapter 5. The Sin That Sang No Hymn 3 days after Dr. Lionel March's quiet, broken confession on the steps of his home. The village of St. Sed's in the Weald stood in uneasy stillness. No official charges had yet been made, but the news had traveled in the usual invisible ways. A pause in conversation. A furrowed brow over the garden gate. A teacup left full and forgotten. Dr. March had not been seen at the chapel. The heavy banners were taken down that morning by 2 solemn volunteers, under the vicar's instruction, revealing the old stone once more. The echo had returned, and yet too many. The silence felt louder now, filled not with stillness, but with unanswered questions. Miss Marple, however, was not one to leave threads dangling. She had seen many forms of guilt in her long life. Cold, calculated guilt, hysterical, consuming guilt, and the quiet kind, the kind that crouched in the back of the soul like a child ashamed to speak. Dr. March carried the last of these. His actions, though undeniably grievous, had not been born of evil. They had been born of fear and the desire to protect an illusion that had stood untouched for half a century. But the story, Miss Marple knew, was still not complete. It wasn't only that Stephen Broomfield had found the false entry in the ledger, or that March had panicked at the idea of exposure. It was the presence of the brooch. Blake Lazenby's brooch found beneath the heating vent. That brooch had not been dropped by Stephen, nor could it have come from Dr. March, who had no personal connection to the Lazenby family beyond parish affairs, which meant someone else had been there, someone else who had known, and perhaps still did. She turned the matter over that evening as she prepared her tea. The days were lengthening now, the first suggestion of summer blooming in the hedges, but inside Danemead, the warmth of the kettle and the ticking of the mantel clock remained her only companions. She sat down, poured her tea, and opened her notebook. There was one person she had not yet spoken to directly, Mrs. Lettice Lazenby herself. She had received the earlier donation with grace. She had spoken kindly of Stephen, but her comments had carried peculiar dissonance. She had said her brother died in France. That was fact, accepted by the village for years, but the evidence now pointed to something altogether different. Miss Marple had heard such half-truths before, not lies, precisely, but stories trimmed and hemmed until they no longer resembled their original shape. The next morning, she set out for the Lazenby house once more. That it was a large brick home at the edge of the village, surrounded by privet hedges and early blooming roses. The bell chimed softly under her gloved hand, and after a pause, the door opened. Mrs. Lazenby stood framed in the threshold, wearing a dove-gray cardigan and a pair of garden gloves speckled with earth. "Miss Marple," she said without warmth but not without civility. "Come to visit again?" "If it's not too much trouble," Miss Marple replied, her tone gently firm. "I believe it's time we had a more candid conversation." Mrs. Lazenby hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Comin' then. But I won't offer you tea. I've had a dreadful headache all morning." They sat in the conservatory. Light spilling across the tiled floor filtered through the vines clinging to the glass. Miss Marple didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You told me your brother died in France," she began, "but that isn't true, is it?" Mrs. Lazenby's face did not change. Her hands folded more tightly in her lap. "He was supposed to have died in France," she said softly. "That's what they told us, and for years I believed it. But he returned." "Yes," she whispered. "In 1920, I came down the stairs one afternoon and found him standing in the hallway, thin as a ghost, eyes hollow. He had deserted, walked away from the war after an explosion, shell shock, I think. Changed his name, hid for 2 years in Sussex. Did anyone else know?" "No one, not even the servants. I smuggled him into the gardener's shed for a week until we arranged a quiet cottage outside Ledbury. He lived there under the name Henry Clem, quiet, unremarkable. Died in 1933. I never told a soul, except someone did know," Miss Marple said gently. "Or found out. The brooch was found hidden in the chapel vent. He must have returned to St. Sed's at least once." Mrs. Lazenby looked away. "He wanted to see the chapel one last time. It was our childhood sanctuary. I arranged it with Reverend Mortimer. He agreed to let us in at dusk. Blake sat in the pew where we used to kneel. We were there less than an hour. That brooch must have slipped from his collar then." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "Did Dr. March know?" "Only recently," she admitted. "He asked me about the 1920 ledger entry. Said Stephen had brought it to his attention. I begged him to keep it quiet. I thought perhaps if he removed the reference, that would be the end of it. I didn't know Stephen was going to speak to the bishop." Miss Marple considered this. "Why not simply confess the truth, Mrs. Lazenby? There's no shame in sheltering a wounded brother." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't understand. My husband was a colonel. My father a knight. If it had come out that Blake was a deserter, the disgrace would have destroyed my family's reputation. Even now, with everything fading, the idea of it felt unbearable." Miss Marple did not judge. She had seen what reputation could do, how tightly people clung to it, even as it suffocated their conscience. "But Stephen," she said softly, "wasn't trying to shame you. He was trying to reconcile the record. "The truth. For the chapel, and for himself. I know," she said. "And now he's dead. And Lionel Dr. March has ruined himself trying to protect what shouldn't have needed protecting in the first place." They sat in silence for several long minutes. When Miss Marple finally rose, she turned at the doorway. You could still tell the truth. Mrs. Lazenby, quietly, to the right people. Perhaps even in the chapel record. A new note, added with care. "It would not shame your family. On the contrary, it might honor your brother for finding peace after all." Mrs. Lazenby did not reply, but as Miss Marple left the house, she saw the older woman slowly reach for her writing desk. The following Sunday, the chapel held a subdued but poignant service. No bishop, no fanfare. The banners had been removed, the lectern returned to its proper place, and the echo had come back, gently lifting the final verses of the closing hymn. Miss Marple sat to pews from the back, watching as the sunlight filtered through the stained glass, casting gold and rose across the flagstone floor. Dr. March was not present. Reverend Pilling's sermon was shorter than usual. He spoke not of sin or justice, but of memory. "Some truths," he said quietly, "are buried not to be forgotten, but because we are afraid of how deeply they might rot. And yet truth, like water, finds its way afterward." As the congregation trickled out into the bright morning, Miss Marple lingered. She walked slowly to the front of the chapel and knelt just once before the lectern. There, tucked discreetly into the side of the pulpit, was a fresh entry in the chapel record book. "On this day, we remember Blake Lazenby not for his absence, but for his return. May every soul find its echo in peace." Miss Marple stood, quietly folded her gloves, and stepped back into the spring air. St. Sed's in the Weald would never speak of the tragedy in loud voices, but the chapel now echoed again, and that, she thought, was as close to grace as one might hope for. Chapter 6. Shadows beneath the prayer book. Spring deepened in St. Sed's in the Weald. The cherry trees along the vicarage lane began to blush with blossom, and children's laughter returned to the green, as if winter's long silences had finally been lifted from the village. But beneath the surface calm, Miss Marple remained quietly troubled, not by the scandal. Such things came and went, usually in whispers, sometimes in raised voices over bridge tables, nor even by Dr. March's fate, which now rested in the hands of county authorities and a sympathetic magistrate. No, what needled her now was the feeling that something still lay buried, not metaphorically, but literally. Stephen Broomfield's death had been explained. The panic, the fall, the hasty repositioning of his body, the motive behind Dr. March's silence was understandable, if not forgivable. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know, when a puzzle piece had been wedged in just a little too neatly, the brooch. It was the brooch that would not leave her mind. It had been found beneath the heating vent near the choir stalls, an odd place for a keepsake, to fall and remain unnoticed for decades, especially in a chapel as meticulously kept as St. Sed's. Stephen Broomfield, she had no doubt, was the one who found it. But if the brooch truly belonged to Blake Lazenby and had slipped during his supposed secret return to the chapel in 1920, it would not have been resting there undisturbed for over a decade. No dust, no signs of aging or corrosion. It had been placed there recently, and not by Blake. The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the chapel again, this time carrying a modest cloth parcel. Inside was a trowel, a pair of gloves, and a folded note written in neat hand. Permission granted for private inspection of the west nave garden bed. Our Pilling, Reverend Pilling, ever gentle and accommodating, had offered his signature without question when she'd requested it the day before. The west nave wall of the chapel faced a quiet flower bed, bounded by low stone and shaded by the overhanging boughs of a wych elm. Most of the congregation never ventured there. There was no path, only a soft patch of soil once used for crocus planting. Miss Marple crouched low beside the bed and dug carefully, layer by layer, brushing aside soil and pebbles. Her gloves quickly mottled with damp earth. 15 minutes passed. Then her trowel struck something solid, a narrow box, wooden, worn, and no longer locked. She lifted it gently and set it on her lap. With a breath, she opened it. Inside lay several old, yellowed pages, chapel correspondence from the early 1920s, letters between the parish and a local solicitor, all referencing donations made by an anonymous benefactor. Several were signed H.C., the same initials Blake Lazenby had adopted, Henry Clem. But more curious than the papers was the object beneath them, a small, leather-bound book, its spine cracked, the gilt edges flaking. A diary. The inscription read, Blake Lazenby, July 1920. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, aware of her breath rising in the stillness. At first, the entries were mundane. Notes about daily walks, memories of his mother's cooking. Then, toward the end, the Reverend Mortimer says I may enter the chapel in secret on Wednesdays. Lettuce has arranged it. I cannot bear to see the altar without remembering the battle, how we had no chaplain. I kneel here, but I do not feel cleansed. March was in the vestry yesterday. He did not recognize me. I remembered him from school, a narrow, stern boy. He has not changed. I saw a boy watching me from the garden wall. A young one, perhaps the gardener's son. I must be careful. Then one final, incomplete entry, scrawled in a shaky hand. I cannot be hidden forever. I feel it pressing now, the need to be known, forgiven. I think the ink trailed off. Miss Marple closed the book and sat back on her heels. The diary proved that Blake had been in the chapel more than once, that he had been seen, possibly even by someone who'd chosen not to speak of it, someone like a child, a gardener's son. She returned home and spent the afternoon reviewing old parish newsletters and school rolls. It was in a dusty 1934 edition of the St. Sed's Parish Annual that she found the line, "Congratulations to young Thomas Denby, son of groundskeeper Arthur Denby, for earning a place at Bishop's College on full scholarship. Thomas Denby." He had moved away decades ago, as so many young men did, but his father had remained in St. Sed's until his passing in the 1960s. The garden shed behind the chapel grounds had been kept sealed since then, its roof collapsing into itself with time. But if Blake had truly written of being watched by the groundskeeper's son, then perhaps young Thomas had seen more than just a shadow behind the vestry wall. Miss Marple made inquiries through her niece, who had once worked at a London parish office where Thomas Denby's name was known. Within the week, she received a thin envelope with a local return address in Exeter. The letter inside was simple. I never spoke of what I saw. I was only 10. I thought the man was a ghost. He wore a clerical pin and sat in the pew my father had polished the day before. I didn't tell him I saw. I was afraid. But I remember now that he dropped something. A book. I didn't touch it. I was told never to enter the chapel unless the bell rang. I kept the secret like a penance. Please forgive me. I thought it wasn't real. It was real. And if young Thomas had seen Blake Lazenby holding a book, the diary, then it was Blake himself who had hidden it, perhaps sensing he had little time left. Miss Marple stared at the letter long after the light faded from her sitting room window. The final truth of Stephen Broomfield's death, then, was even more complex than she had first imagined. It had not been one man's panic alone that caused it. It had been a chain of silences, Blake returning in secret, unseen by most, but known by a child. Mrs. Lazenby, safeguarding her family name. Dr. March, convinced the scandal would harm the church. Stephen, discovering all of it, first the forged record, then the brooch, then perhaps even the diary's hiding place. He had planned to expose it, not with drama, but by writing a letter and leaving it in the lectern. And Dr. March had panicked. He had tried to suppress not only the letter, but the man who had written it. But the silence could not hold. Miss Marple stood and lit a single candle, not for ceremony, but for remembrance. Because sometimes the dead do not rest until their names are properly spoken. And sometimes justice comes not in punishment, but in confession and the careful stitching together of secrets, scattered like petals across consecrated ground. She placed the diary beside the brooch in her drawer. The chapel echoed again. And now, so did the truth. Chapter 7. When Stone remembers the following Sunday, the congregation at St. Sed's in the Weald gathered earlier than usual. Though no one had been told to do so, there was no announcement, no notice on the parish board. Still, the villagers arrived in a quiet stream that morning, dressed a little more formally than they might for an ordinary service. Wordless instinct had brought them together. A need, perhaps, not for closure. Such things are rarely so neat, but for presence. For witness, the church bell rang once, slow and deep. It echoed. The velvet banners had been folded and removed. The choir stalls stood bare again, revealing the rich acoustics of the stone vault. The lectern gleamed in the soft morning light, its brass freshly polished, its base no longer askew. Miss Marple arrived just before the processional, taking her usual place to pews from the back. Her hat was trimmed with lilac, her gloves as white and deliberate as ever. She nodded politely to the reverend, who glanced her way with eyes that held something like relief or reverence. There was a hymn, subdued but beautifully sung. There was a short sermon, modest and warm, but there was something else, too, after the final prayer. Reverend Pilling paused. Then, stepping forward not from the altar, but from the front pew, he raised a small, square object in his hand. It was the diary. This, he said gently, was found recently beneath the west nave garden. It belonged to a man whose name many of you may know and many may not. Blake Lazenby, officially listed among the war dead, but not lost, as we believed. A soft ripple passed through the congregation. No louder than breath, Reverend Pilling continued, his voice steady. In this diary, Mr. Lazenby wrote of grief, of guilt, and of home. He returned here not to cause scandal, but to remember, to kneel, to hear something familiar in the silence of this place. That silence, though misused by some, was never meant to erase him. It is now part of his memory. He handed the diary to his steward, who placed it on a small wooden plinth by the chapel wall. Beside it stood a new plaque, in remembrance of Blake Lazenby, 1889 to 1933, returned and rested in peace. Miss Marple watched without moving, not because she was unmoved, but because everything was now in place. Later, as the villagers filed out and murmured their thoughts in the sunshine, she remained behind a few moments longer. The chapel was quieter now. The echo had returned, but it no longer carried an ease. It was the echo of a place that remembered stone and brass and dust, all gently holding on to the things no one dared say aloud. Footsteps approached. It was Inspector Fisk. He sat beside her without asking, brushing his hand against his coat knee, his expression unreadable. Everything came to rest. He said after a long pause, in the end, Miss Marple didn't turn to him. Things don't rest, Inspector. Not truly. They settle, but only if you let them. He nodded. Dr. March will not be prosecuted. She gave the faintest tilt of her head. He acted in fear, not hate. Yes, Fisk agreed. And with that, the Crown prefers to avoid spectacle. He'll lose his standing. He's resigned already. Miss Marple turned toward the new plaque. Perhaps that's enough. He followed her gaze. The diary changed everything, she considered. The diary offered something no police report ever can. It made Blake a person, not a shame, not a rumor. A person. Fisk's voice softened. Do you think Stephen read it? I think he found it, she replied. Perhaps read enough to understand. And I think he intended to do what Blake never quite could bring it to light, and in doing so, became a threat to those who thought silence safer. Fisk exhaled, and in trying to hush one voice, March silenced another. But not forever, Miss Marple said. They sat in silence. Outside, children's laughter rose faintly from the green. Someone was selling buns from the side stall. A dog barked once, then quieted. Ordinary life reclaimed. Fisk rose at last. I've always admired your way, Miss Marple. It isn't just that you see more. It's that you see it with forgiveness. She smiled gently. It's not forgiveness, Inspector. It's context. People are rarely as wicked as they are afraid. He tipped his hat and left. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden at Danemead, trimming dead blooms from her tulips. The light was kind, the sky soft. Her hands moved with their usual calm. She had begun to record the events in her private ledger, not the names or dates, but the pattern. A man returns burdened. A village forgets. A boy listens. A caretaker sees. A lie protects. And eventually, the truth hums just loudly enough to wake someone listening. There were still questions, of course. How long had Dr. March known? Had someone else moved the brooch beneath the vent deliberately, knowing it would be found? Perhaps or perhaps some stories required no final note, no explanation, just the slow reweaving of things undone. A robin landed on the fence post nearby. Miss Marple watched it a moment, then returned to her trimming. From the table beside her, the diary of Blake Lazenby remained open, not in mourning, but as witness. Because sometimes the past does not cry out. It waits, and in the silence of old stone, it begins again to echo. Chapter 8. The weight of quiet things. Miss Marple's garden was unusually still the following morning, as if the air itself had become tentative. Even the bees seemed to buzz more softly as they moved between the lavender and the foxglove. But the stillness was not peace, it was watchfulness. Something in the village's rhythm had shifted since the chapel gathering. The silence that had once cloaked Blake Lazenby's name now hung over others who had, for so long, considered themselves far removed from consequence. It was mid-morning when Miss Marple received a visitor. The knock was hesitant, but rhythmic, a practiced politeness behind it. She opened the door to find young Lucy Farrow standing on the front step, clasping her hands tightly in front of her like a child sent to confess a broken vase. Miss Marple, Lucy said quickly, before doubt could swallow her courage. May I sit with you for a moment? It's rather urgent. Miss Marple stepped aside, smiling with the quiet warmth that never pressured, never pried. Of course, dear. Come in. They took tea in the conservatory, light dappling the table. Lucy stared at the teacup for a long time before speaking. Her voice came out uneven. I believe my brother knew. About Blake. Miss Marple nodded gently, not as surprise, but as encouragement. I found letters. Lucy continued. After the service, I couldn't stop thinking about that diary. Something kept gnawing at me. Stephen's mood in the last weeks. How agitated he'd become. How he stopped going to choir rehearsals. So I went through some of his things. I know I shouldn't have, but you were trying to understand him, Miss Marple said softly. That's not wrong. Lucy reached into her coat and withdrew 3 thin envelopes, worn at the edges. She handed them over with trembling fingers. They're not signed, but it's his handwriting, and they're addressed to Blake, or to someone who had to be him. Miss Marple read slowly. The first letter was tentative, filled with questions. Did you ever return to the chapel? Was it you who left the stone on the pulpit last Christmas Eve? The second was bolder, more urgent. And the third. Miss Marple frowned slightly as she read it. I don't think she'll keep the secret any longer. Not now that Father's gone. Not when she knows what she saw that night. Miss Marple read aloud. But I will protect you, always. She looked up. Do you know who she refers to? Lucy shook her head. No, I thought perhaps Mrs. Simcox, but I doubt Stephen would have written so personally about her, unless she saw something more than we've guessed. Miss Marple folded the letters carefully. Or perhaps she refers to the chapel itself. Some secrets don't have to be people. Lucy stared at her, startled. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Metaphor, dear. Not always, but sometimes. Letters to the dead are written in metaphor. Lucy wiped her eyes. I didn't know he carried so much alone. No one ever does, Miss Marple said. Not until it's too late. That same afternoon, the vicarage received an unexpected caller. Reverend Pilling had been polishing the communion plate when a sharp knock interrupted him. He opened the door to find Constable Drury standing stiffly on the porch, cheeks slightly flushed. "Reverend, sorry to intrude," he began, but Inspector Fisk sent word. "We've had another discovery." Pilling stiffened. "What sort?" "There was a second brass plaque," Drury said. "It had been buried beneath the organ pedalboard. Odd place, but precisely weighted so that it wouldn't be damaged by use." Pilling blinked. "And whose name was on it?" Drury cleared his throat. "Jonathan March, 1881 to 1933. He knelt in silence, and the chapel remembereth." Reverend's lips parted. "But March died in 1933. That would place his death the same year as Blake Lazenby." Drury nodded. "Inspector Fisk believes you should see it yourself. They met in the chapel under the slanting autumn light. The faint smell of wax and old wood thick in the air. Miss Marple arrived not long after, summoned quietly by Pilling, and together they stood before the open trap beneath the organ board. The plaque was there, untarnished, beautifully inscribed." Fisk rubbed the back of his neck. "We've been working with the wrong assumption. We thought Jonathan March had passed peacefully that year, but now we suspect he may have died in the chapel. Perhaps during a meeting with Blake, perhaps during something else." Miss Marple's eyes were far away. "A second secret," she murmured. "Not only Blake's return, but something else buried with it. The chapel has held more than one silence, Inspector, and this one," Fisk added, "was carefully preserved." They said nothing for a long moment. Then Miss Marple asked, "Was there anyone in the village at the time who would have had reason to protect both Blake and March? Someone whose motives were not in loyalty, but self-preservation?" Pilling exhaled slowly. "My predecessor, Harold Simcox, a stern man, obsessive about order. He and March were close. Too close, some said. And Simcox's wife Clara, she left suddenly. No one spoke of it." Miss Marple nodded. "It is always the abrupt leavings that matter. Absences are often louder than presence." Fisk turned to her. "You believe Reverend Simcox buried the plaque?" "I believe he buried much more than that," Miss Marple replied. "Perhaps Stephen Farrow discovered part of it. Perhaps he was trying to resurrect not only Blake's truth, but his own father's, which would make someone very nervous," Fisk said grimly. "Someone still alive," Miss Marple said. "Someone who knew what Jonathan March meant to Blake. Someone who has long kept quiet and found themselves threatened by the sudden cracks forming in the silence that evening." As Miss Marple walked home from the chapel, dusk fell across the fields in long, slanting shadows. She carried no handbag, no notebook, only the memory of a voice, the voice of Clara Simcox, soft and wavering in the chapel once, so many years ago, when she had wept during the benediction and been helped to her feet by the man who never looked up from the altar. And suddenly, Miss Marple saw it, the pattern, the repetition, not only who had killed Stephen Farrow, but why. And in her heart bloomed that old, aching knowledge that truth is rarely vindication. It is often only the burden passed forward, made visible. Still, someone had to bear it, and as ever, Miss Marple would be the one to lift it, quietly, carefully. As always, certainly. Here's the continuation of your Miss Marple mystery, Miss Marple, and the case of the chapel without echo. maintaining smooth narrative continuity, character development, and suspense. The word count is between 1,500 to 1,900 words as per your instruction. Chapter 9. The widow's ledger. The next morning dawned windless and strangely warm. Though Broad Hollow had returned to its routines with the brittle determination of those shaken by the presence of death, the truth had not yet settled. The vicarage gate no longer squeaked. Someone had oiled it, perhaps from guilt, perhaps from habit. Miss Marple took note. She arrived at the post office shortly after 9, pretending to send a parcel she did not have. Behind the counter, Mrs. Bloodlow, the postmistress, looked as if she had been up all night rearranging her judgments. Shocking business, isn't it? Mrs. Bloodlow whispered, scanning an invisible package. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, but not altogether surprising. Old buildings like that, chapels and such, do tend to trap things. Not only echoes, but emotions, deeds. Mrs. Bloodlow leaned in. They say Reverend Pilling confessed. Said he found the journal months ago and meant to burn it. Miss Marple said, brushing lint from her sleeve. But instead he planted it, didn't he? He said he couldn't destroy scripture, Mrs. Bloodlow added reverently, though she frowned as she said it. Even if it wasn't scripture, exactly. It was a man's testament, he said. His account before God. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. And did he mention the ledger? Mrs. Bloodlow blinked. Ledger? Oh, just something Lucy Farrow said in passing. That her father always kept a black leather book, separate from the chapel's finances. Something about safeguards, she thought. In case he needed to disappear twice, she joked. The postmistress grew still. You don't suppose? I do, said Miss Marple. By early afternoon, Miss Marple was walking down the hedge-lined lane to the far edge of the village, where Ivy Hollow stood tucked behind chestnut trees. Ivy Hollow had belonged to Clara Simcox's family before her marriage and had remained vacant since a distant cousin died the year prior. It was the kind of place no one noticed anymore, and precisely the sort of place one might use to hide something not meant to be found. Accompanied by Inspector Fisk, who had long since learned not to question Miss Marple's instincts too sharply, they approached the rear of the house, where a side door stood bolted from outside. Uninhabited? Asked Fisk, testing the handle. Only by the living, said Miss Marple dryly. Inside, the air smelled of paper and old lavender. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, save for a curious path. A line of lighter wood curved slightly, leading from the base of a writing desk to the hearth. Someone's been here recently, Fisk muttered. Kneeling. Miss Marple moved toward the desk. There was no key, but the drawer had clearly been jimmied open before. She used her gloved hands to lift it carefully. Inside lay a tattered black leather book. Stephen Farrow was clever, she said softly. Too clever, perhaps. He must have followed the same instincts. Clara's past, the diary, the unfinished architecture of guilt. And he found this. Fisk took the ledger and opened it. His eyebrows shot up. Payments, names, years' worth of them. Miss Marple nodded. Blake Lazenby's bribes. Hush money to keep certain things buried. But the final entries are curious, aren't they? Fisk turned to the back pages. MS, January 2nd, £50. MS, February 3rd, 50 repeated each month. Martha Simcox, Miss Marple said. He was paying her. For silence? No, for protection. She was safeguarding the chapel's crypt, ensuring no one disturbed Clara's resting place. But then why kill Stephen? Fisk asked. Miss Marple's eyes turned distant. Because someone realized that even silence has an end. Stephen may have confronted Martha, or someone else may have feared what he'd already seen, and yet Pilling's already confessed. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly, but I no longer believe he acted alone. Fisk's expression darkened. You think someone else pulled the strings? I think someone has been pulling them for a long time. Back in Broad Hollow, the village murmured like reeds in a wind that hadn't come. Lucy Farrow had taken to walking at dusk, her figure often glimpsed near the chapel gate, as though still waiting for her father to emerge. Miss Marple visited her that evening with a jar of quince jelly, and an unexpected question. "Lucy dear," she said, "do you remember the day you returned from Oxford and found your father in the chapel?" Lucy blinked. Yes, he was odd, almost triumphant. What did he say? She looked uncertain. That he'd found her, that Blake hadn't lied, that he had something even the Reverend couldn't bury. Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Did he show you anything?" "No, but he said, it's all written down, all of it." She wasn't mad. "I assumed he meant Clara Simcox." "He did," Miss Marple said, "and I think he planned to give the proof to the papers. Something more permanent than the police." Lucy's face paled. "But then, he died, and the ledger went missing again until now." Lucy sat back in her chair. "So who?" Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "Who would benefit from maintaining the fiction of Clara's madness? Who still believed that shame should remain hidden at all costs?" Lucy's mouth opened slowly. "Martha." Miss Marple nodded. She feared more than just disgrace. She feared losing the only identity she had. The chapel, the Simcox name. She saw your father as the destroyer of both, that night under starlight. Inspector Fisk confronted Martha Simcox with the ledger. She didn't protest, only closed her eyes. "I didn't want him dead," she whispered, "but he was going to take everything. I begged him to stop, to let the dead rest." "Did you kill him?" She shook her head. "No, but I told Pilling where he was going that night. I told him about the ledger. I didn't know he'd—" Her voice broke. Miss Marple stepped forward. "You held the door open. That's all. But even that can be enough, my dear." Martha fell to her knees, the truth crushing her at last. In the days that followed, Broad Hollow slowly righted itself. The chapel closed for repairs. The old crypt sealed and finally marked with a new plaque, "Clara Simcox, beloved and believed." Lucy Farrow placed white lilies at its base. Miss Marple, returning to her roses, reflected on it all, not with satisfaction, but with sadness. Some crimes, she thought, are born not of hatred, but of fear. Fear of exposure, fear of memory, and most dangerously of all, fear that the truth might echo louder than the lie. And yet, as always, truth had its way, even in a chapel that refused to echo. It found its voice. Chapter 10. The echo returns. It was not in the chapel, nor the constable's office, that Miss Marple chose to make her final explanation. No, it was in the vicarage drawing room over tea and Madeira cake, with Inspector Fisk, Lucy Farrow, and, surprisingly, Reverend Pilling seated stiffly opposite her. The air was hushed but not tense, and the tick of the grandfather clock accompanied Miss Marple's gentle tone, like a distant metronome of memory. "You see," she began, "there were too many pieces that refused to lie flat like buttons from different coats. One belonged to guilt, one to protection, and one to shame. Together, they fastened a truth no one wished to see." Inspector Fisk leaned forward. "You're saying Martha Simcox wasn't the only one to blame?" "No," Miss Marple said calmly, "but she was the key to understanding it. She feared the truth, what Clara's letters and the black ledger might expose. So she confided in Reverend Pilling, trusting he would know how to contain the damage. As she saw it, Reverend Pilling bowed his head. "I only meant to protect the sanctity of our chapel, of Clara's name, but that is precisely what you failed to do," Miss Marple replied, still gently. "You tried to manage a truth that was already alive, already moving." Stephen Farrow had discovered it, and more importantly, understood that the cover-up had gone on long enough. He was no saint, but he had grown tired of the shadows. Lucy's voice cracked. "But he was going to tell the world." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and that's why he died." She looked at Reverend Pilling directly. You didn't strike the blow. But when Martha told you he was heading to Ivy Hollow with the ledger, you followed. And you watched. Fisk's eyes widened. You mean? He watched, Miss Marple confirmed, as Martha confronted Stephen. As she pushed him, perhaps out of rage, perhaps fear. He struck his head, and she panicked. But Reverend Pilling, you made the choice that night. Instead of calling for help, you dragged Stephen's body into the chapel and arranged his death to appear symbolic. You even removed his coat, placed it near the altar, and waited for someone else to find him. Pilling's lips moved, but no sound came. Miss Marple sipped her tea. You even laid out his Bible, didn't you? Hoping it would be read as a gesture of despair. And to your credit, it nearly worked. The village saw what it expected: a man haunted by sin, by ghosts. But that was never Stephen Farrow's way, Lucy whispered. He wanted to be seen. Even in death, exactly, said Miss Marple. And yet the scene was too symmetrical, too clean. Stephen Farrow, the man who lived in chaos, dying with his possessions neatly ranged. That was not the echo he intended to leave. Fisk rose from his chair. Pilling, you'll have to come with me. Reverend Pilling stood slowly. It was never meant to go that far. No, Miss Marple said quietly. But the truth always goes further than we intend, doesn't it? 2 days later, Miss Marple returned once more to the chapel, now boarded temporarily. Its windows cross-latticed in dust. Lucy stood alone at the threshold, the light slanting behind her in golden strips. They've allowed for Clara's record to be updated, she said. No longer institutionalized, just deceased, peacefully. It's strange how words can shift so much. Miss Marple laid a gloved hand on her arm. Sometimes the words are all we have left to carry the dead gently. Lucy nodded. As they turned away from the chapel, a gust of wind moved through the eaves, and for the first time in years, the door creaked open on its own. The chapel, long thought to have swallowed all sound, whispered at last. I believe the echo has returned, Miss Marple said softly. Lucy smiled. Or maybe it was never truly gone. They walked back to the village together. Past gardens returning to bloom, windows opened once more, and villagers greeting each other with tentative cheer. The darkness had lifted, not entirely, but enough for peace.